Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Monday, the 3rd of March, where we're putting some closure onto Midsummer Night's Dream, getting prepared for our next comedy, Much Ado About Nothing, and also talking about our first paper, which will be coming up soon. So, one of the reasons why Shakespeare has the reputation that he does is because of the superiority of the writing. So, one of the things that I had asked you to do was to identify a quote that you thought had some relevance and talk a little bit about why you thought it would have that relevance. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of Shakespeare's language. The writing oftentimes is poetic, as you can tell with Midsummer Night's Dream and all of the other plays that we'll be following. Oftentimes, we will have passages that utilize rhyme or that utilize other poetic techniques, such as alliteration, the initial repetition of consonant sounds. Sometimes we will have passages that use iambic pentameter, the 10-syllable line that we talked about when we talked about Shakespeare's sonnets. Definitely, we know that Shakespeare is fond of symbolism and metaphor. So there are usually multiple layers of possible meanings and interpretations in Shakespeare's dialogue. And just the switch between verse and prose, verse being poetry, which is the staggered line, and prose being complete sentences from one end of the line to the other. And in theory, verse or poetry should be reserved for the higher order characters on the chain of being. So, kings and queens and nobles and things of that nature. And prose should be reserved for the lower level characters on the chain of being, for instance, laborers. We know that Shakespeare will oftentimes mix that up in order to be able to make some social commentary about the ability of somebody to perhaps descend into irrationality or descend into the base because of their actions, not necessarily because of their social station. And you'll see that with the shift in language moving into prose, or vice versa. You'll have a character who is speaking prose, and then ultimately they begin speaking verse. And this goes to show that you don't need necessarily status or formal education in order to have intellect or the ability to reason. So, some of the quotes that I wanted to point out, and you can see in the notes below that I have them listed, just some of Shakespeare's wit. And one example of this is in Act 1, Scene 1, line 93 through 94. And note, because we're talking about Shakespearean plays that are divided up into act, scene, and line, we don't have to rely on page number. So, regardless of the edition we're using, we should all be able to find Act 1, Scene 1, line 93 through 94, which is how we document quotes. And soon we'll be talking about what are the conventions for writing a paper and how to write a paper. And usually when we use quotation from a text for support, we reference the page number, for instance. But with Shakespearean dramas and Renaissance dramas, actually, that are also divided into act and scene and line, you can use the act, the scene, and the line, much like we've got below. So you've got the Roman numeral and a capital, so that would be the act. The Roman numeral in a lowercase with a period, that would be the scene. And then the Arabic numerals 93 through 94 to indicate lines 93 through 94. When Lysander says, "You have her father's love, Demetrius. Let me have Hermia's." It's just a sly little piece of wit, but Shakespeare will oftentimes insert those in his language. Of course, we need to get backstory. So we learn a little bit about history, for instance, when Lysander says, Demetrius made love to Neater's daughter, Helena. That's in Act 1, Scene 1, line 107. And made love would mean at that point wooing, not necessarily having or consummating their relationship, because it's important that these female characters who are unmarried be virginal until the ending of the play. If they weren't virginal, they were considered, for lack of a better word, damaged. And the idea that one needed to maintain one's virginity is going to be a hugely important issue when we get to Much Ado About Nothing. If you're looking for a moral, and there are many morals that we can find in the play, perhaps it comes from Lysander in Act 1, Scene 1, line 134, that the course of true love never did run smooth. Obviously, we see that love is fraught with difficulties. Now, one of the things that Shakespeare likes to do is to compare and contrast what would be good writing with bad writing, particularly when it comes to utilizing the play within a play with Bottom and his cohorts, because that's an illustration of bad writing. And as I had mentioned earlier, it was a wonderful opportunity for Shakespeare to make a dig at his competition, that this is the kind of product that they were producing, as opposed to what Shakespeare would produce. And you can just see a small example of a comparison with good and bad rhyme right in the very first act. And Hermia is speaking at this point, and you can see that she's speaking in a poetic fashion, which is what we would expect of someone of her station. And she says, "Take comfort no more. He no more shall see my face. Lysander myself will fly this place. Before the time I did Lysander see, seemed Athens as a paradise to me. Oh then, what graces in my love do dwell, that he hath turned a heaven unto a hell." So you can hear the rhyme there, which you would determine by looking at the last word of each line. That's in Act 1, Scene 1, line 202 through 207. And what's so beautiful about that passage is that it pretty much effortlessly helps to forward the plot, as opposed to an example of bad rhyme, which happened shortly thereafter. And this is with Bono when he's rehearsing. And he says, "The raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far, and make and mar the foolish fates." And that's in Act 1, Scene 2, line 31 through 38. Even worse, after that, he says, that was lofty. So he basically praises himself. And while we've got language that rhymes, just because something has rhyme, it doesn't necessarily make it a good piece of poetry, because he's just uttered nonsense in this instance. Now, one of the major themes of this drama, and there are multiple, are the power dynamics that can occur in relationship. And we see that played out when Titania says in Act 2, Scene 1, line 63, that she has forsworn Oberon's bed and company. That means that she is denying him sexual relations because of the arguments that they've been having about the changeling boy, which might explain why he feels so justified in humiliating and embarrassing Titania. Now, sometimes you'll have some dialogue that sounds a bit odd, and it's there mostly for the audience to understand the forwarding of the plot. So, for instance, in Act 2, Scene 1, line 186, Oberon at one point says, "I am invisible," which is kind of odd. This is the cue to the audience that because Oberon is a fairy, we're supposed to assume that he's invisible at this point. So when the humans enter onto the stage, they have to act as if he's not there, even though obviously the actor is there. So it was even thought that during the time of the Renaissance that perhaps they had something like an invisibility costume. So it might be a kind of fabric that was supposed to denote invisibility. Perhaps it was something that was sheer. So the idea of the threats to take virginity occur early on in the play, Act 2, Scene 1, line 236 to 237, when Demetrius says to Helena, remember Helena is basically chasing him, "If thou follow me, I shall do thee mischief in the wood," which is his way of saying that he will take her virginity, which again is another piece of evidence to show that she has not lost her virginity yet. And of course, gender dynamics is one of the more interesting elements of this particular play. We've got female characters who defy many of the stereotypes of their time. Some defy them successfully and some defy them unsuccessfully. In this instance, when Helena is talking about in Act 2, Scene 1, line 240 to 242, your wrongs do set a scandal on my sex. We cannot fight for love as men may do. We should be wooed, and we're not made to woo. Helena's a complicated character. She definitely seems very passive, very meek. We could even use modern day language, such as a stalker, and the idea that she wants to be treated as a dog, as a spaniel, just so that she can be in the vicinity of the man she loves is obviously a very uncomfortable thing in 2025 in particular. But she does make an interesting argument in the second act when she says that women are not allowed to be or not expected to be the pursuer, yet she takes on that active role. So, in that way, she is defying the stereotype of her time, and she does so successfully because by the ending of the play, she gets exactly what it is that she wants. So, I guess we could see Helena as being both very weak and passive, but also rather strong and defiant. Now, at one point on the second act, Hermia and Lysander are in the woods, and she says to Lysander, for love and courtesy lie further off in humane modesty. And at this particular point, Lysander is trying to lie next to her. Of course, the idea is that in midsummer, a pagan holiday that's associated with fertility, in the woods where wild things can happen, hence the name wilderness, in the night, under the cover of darkness, he could take her virginity and she might be tempted to give it to him. So she says, for love and courtesy lie further off, is that she doesn't want that temptation. Again, a piece of evidence illustrating what would have been so important in the Renaissance for female, that female retain her virginity until after marriage. So in the third act, we talked a little bit about how you can expect the Shakespearean play to sort of follow a pyramid structure. So the first act, which would be perhaps the left bottom side of the pyramid, would be the introduction of characters, and then the second act would be the beginning of illustrating conflict, and then the third act, the pinnacle of the pyramid, the tip, would be the height of conflict. And then we've got the beginning of resolution with the fourth act as we go down the right side of the pyramid. And then finally resolution, which would be the fifth act, which would be at the bottom of that pyramid. Though Midsummer is slightly different in that it seems that we reach resolution in Act 4, but we know that Act 5, play within a play, is so important in terms of illustrating some of the themes that we've witnessed in the first four acts. But in the third act, Bottom says, and if you're looking for another moral, perhaps this would work. Reason and love keep little company. In Act 3, Scene 2, line 143 through 144. And note that Bottom is the only character who, at least at this point, starts the play, along with Puck, without any kind of love relationship. So perhaps Bottom has a certain level of insight, even though he's a laborer, even though he's at the bottom of the social scale, even though he's, for lack of a better word, an ass, which of course he's literally turned into. But he's able to see what perhaps some of the other characters cannot see, that reason and love keep little company nowadays. But Puck, who's involved in no love relationship throughout the entire play, is able to determine in Act 3, Scene 2, line 115, what fools these mortals be. And perhaps that's another theme, that love makes us fools. But I would argue that it's not just the morals, because the fairies are also acting foolish. Some of the insults in what I call the catfight scene between the women in particular in the third act, I find to be quite powerful. So when Helena basically insults Hermia by calling her a puppet, this is in Act 3, Scene 2, line 288. Obviously, a puppet is something that's small, and Hermia is of small stature. So this is a height insult. But also, a puppet is manipulated by an outside force. So basically saying that Hermia doesn't have any kind of independence. And then Hermia responds to Helena, calling her, you painted maypole. Painted would be cosmetics, so that would be unnatural beauty, the attempt to deceive and manipulate through cosmetics. And maypole, reference to May Day, which is what's referenced towards the ending of the play, another pagan holiday associated with fertility, but also the maypole was a specific symbol that was supposed to represent phallus. So this is a double insult, talking about how first she's painted. So in other words, she's much like a whore because of her use of cosmetics, but she's also a maypole. So she's also basically a phallus. And think about how quickly love can turn to hate, perhaps one of the other messages in the play, where now you've got Lysander telling Hermia, whom he had loved previously, away you Ethiop, which is an insult. He's talking about Ethiopia, dark hair and dark eyes. Act 3, Scene 2, line 258, usually not read as dark skin. And Lysander continues on and says, oh, should I hurt her? Strike her? Kill her dead? So this is his first go-to, is that, oh, maybe I should hurt her or kill her. Oh, I guess not. And remember, he had been completely in love previously. And then Lysander continues on, Act 3, Scene 2, line 327 or 329, when he says to Hermia, get you gone, you dwarf, you minimus, you bead, you acorn. And again, these are all insults associated with height. So in Act 4, which is where we get a resolution, and perhaps it's the best of all possible worlds for resolution from Theseus's perspective. Remember, as the king, he needs to have a ruling. He decides he's going to overbear Aegeus's will because now he's got the four lovers, Hermia and Lysander and Helena and Demetrius, and they're all content with that love relationship. And this was the love relationship that existed prior to the play. So I guess you could see that as a kind of resolution or happy ending. And what this means is that Hermia is going to get her way. In other words, she defied her father successfully, which is a rather progressive statement, particularly for a female during this time period. And Helena will also get her way. And the way it happened is that she took on the role of pursuer. Now, granted, of course, Helena's situation is much more complex because Demetrius has been manipulated through love juice. But again, during the time of the Renaissance, this might have been seen as a restoration of order because they had been a couple prior to the beginning of the play. So this is just a resolution of putting things back the way that they were. And another moral, if we're looking for morals, Act 4, Scene 1, line 206, coming from, of all people, Bottom. And again, Bottom has perhaps more insight than many of the other characters in the play. Not unusual for Shakespeare to put insight into characters of lower social station. When Bottom says, and he might not even realize how insightful his statement is, in Act 4, Scene 1, line 206, man is but an ass. And of course, this is humorous because Bottom is an ass and was literally turned into an ass, which would have been considered the most well-endowed creature in the animal kingdom, as I had mentioned earlier in another class. So there's, a lot of sexual undertones in this particular play. Now, Shakespeare is not above flattery. We saw how he would do that in his sonnets. And considering the fact that he has perhaps offended a number of people over the course of the play, it's not a bad idea to perhaps flatter the person who would be most important, which would be the queen. Now, Queen Elizabeth enjoyed going to plays, so even though plays were seen as kind of lowbrow, she attended the plays frequently, for which we can all be grateful, because if she hadn't done that, I don't know if these plays would have existed. But nevertheless, there is a scene that seems to be seemingly unimportant. But one of the things about Shakespeare that we'll soon find is everything is important, where it happens to be a dialogue between the king and the queen, Theseus and Hippolyta. Remember, we're introduced to them at the beginning of the play, where Theseus has basically conquered Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons, which I would liken to a political kind of union that would be quite common during the time period. But we know that we have to have a happy ending, so it seems that they've come to some sort of an agreement by the ending of the play. And again, that wouldn't have necessarily been unusual, that affection developed after, not necessarily before marriage. But at this point, he says, "Where I've come, great clerks have proposed to greet me with premeditated welcomes, shiver and look pale, in conclusion, dumbly broken off. Yet I picked a welcome." This is in Act 4, Scene 1, line 93 through 100. Basically, what Theseus is discussing is that oftentimes he's had subjects who haven't greeted him properly just because they're so intimidated and so nervous being in his presence. And that Theseus sees this as a compliment, not as an insult, because they wouldn't be intimidated and they wouldn't be nervous if they didn't think so highly of him. And this statement is usually viewed as a tribute to Queen Elizabeth, because if Queen Elizabeth was there watching the play, she would probably see some of herself in this, or at least would believe that she saw some of herself in this, that I too am a similar kind of ruler, that I'm quite gracious, and that my subjects who may not necessarily greet me properly, I am gracious towards them because I understand that they're not greeting me properly, not out of disrespect, but because of course, the fact that they hold me in such high regard. So complimenting the queen is never a bad idea if you are creating a play that has the possibility of offending. And obviously, Act 5, the play within a play, gives a wonderful opportunity for mirroring everything that we've seen thus far with Shakespeare. And it also provides opportunity for bawdiness. So I don't take credit nor do I take blame for this particular line. In Act 5, Scene 1, line 190 through 191, I remember very clearly when I first studied this play and the class's attention was brought to this line, which for me at the time seemed rather innocent. And this is in the Pyramus and Thisbe production, where Thisbe says, "My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones with lime and hair knit up in thee." And the idea is that this is a reference, or a possible reference, to oral sex. "My cherry lips, my lips have often kissed thy stones being testicles, thy stones with lime and hair." We're talking about pubic hair, "knit up in thee." And prior to this is talking about the wall hearing my moans. Again, they could be moans of sexual pleasure. Now, Hippolyta is one of the characters who expresses what all of the characters are thinking as they're watching Pyramus and Thisbe. Hippolyta says in Act 5, Scene 1, line 210, "This is the silliest stuff I've ever heard." And of course, the idea is that, yes, it's silly and ridiculous, and they're laughing at it. But never once do any of these characters reflect upon the fact that they too were equally absurd when it came to love. And of course, the message is for us as viewers and readers of this play, that if we can laugh and we don't reflect upon how we've acted like asses in love, or how we've been blind in love, or any of the other commentaries that occur within the play, then we have learned nothing from A Midsummer Night's Dream. So having an apology at the end is not a bad idea. So it comes from Puck, and the closing apology in Act 5, Scene 1, line 423 is perhaps one of Shakespeare's most famous passages. "If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here, and no more yielding but a dream." And of course, the idea that love is like a dream is something that can't be controlled. It's something that's not real. And there is this sort of dreamlike fantasy element that's associated with it as well. The problem with this apology coming from Puck is that, and not one of the other characters, is that Puck is untrustworthy and mischievous. So when Puck says, "If I am an honest Puck," he's not an honest Puck. So how can we believe the fact that he is basically apologizing? And Puck also takes the opportunity to ask, "Give me your hands if we be friends." In other words, he's asking for applause. So And good night unto you all. This is basically our cue that this is going to be the ending of the play, so it's time for us to applaud. And he talks about if they could escape the serpent's tongue. And the serpent's tongue is the hiss, the booing and the hissing. So Puck takes this opportunity to ask for applause, to ask that there not be any criticism, any booing or hissing, to remind us that the play is over, that we should be leaving, and to apologize, but it's a somewhat suspicious and backhanded apology. So, um, not at all surprising when we think about Shakespeare, because Shakespeare has multiple levels usually associated with them. So, our next class is when we get to talk about another comedy, Much Ado About Nothing. Now, we've been spending our time with Midsummer Night's Dream, which is a comedy that's very much set in a world of fantasy. Fairies. So some people enjoy that and some people don't. So if you're not much for fantasy, you might enjoy Much Ado About Nothing but more so because it's firmly established in the world of reality. However, we will see many of the same themes. And what perhaps is even more interesting about Much Ado About Nothing is that it really is preparing us for one of Shakespeare's most famous tragedies, Othello. However, Much Ado About Nothing is a comedy, so that means that everything has to end well. That means no one dies. Someone might be mistaken to be dead, but no one dies. And there is marriage or the promise of marriage. Once again, we'll be watching a production. I wanted to show a Hollywood production of Much Ado About Nothing so you could get a very different kind of sense of how Shakespeare could be produced. It's with Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson, and it was from the 1990s. And if you know anything at all about Kenneth Branagh, he's one of the leading Shakespearean actors of our time. And it stars, of all people, in addition, Keanu Reeves. This was before his mega fame. And he's cast in the role of the villain. Now that said, I don't know necessarily if that was the best casting, but from a Hollywood perspective, since Keanu Reeves was up and coming, it definitely would have brought audience members in. And that's one of the things that you have to think about with a Hollywood production. If you're producing something at the Globe is going to bring in audiences regardless of the production because it's the reconstructed Globe Theater. So it already is drawing in a certain population. But a movie theater is a completely different thing. So what you're trying to do is to make it accessible for the general public, especially a public who may not necessarily have read the play. And I think they successfully were able to do that with Much Ado About Nothing. They also cast, which I think was really clever, Denzel Washington. Again, very powerful actor. And I really appreciated that they didn't put Denzel Washington, a black actor, in the role of the villain, that they put him in a role that was much more heroic. So kudos to Kenneth Branagh for making that particular casting decision. But we'll talk a little bit more about Much Ado About Nothing next class, which I am hopeful that you have either concluded or you are close to concluding with reading. Because next class, I also wanted to talk about writing papers. And as you know, I have a due date of about midway through the semester, and believe it or not, we're getting close to that. But certainly we can negotiate, but after we finish up Much Ado About Nothing, you really want to be handing in a paper shortly thereafter. If you haven't already, as you know, I have rolling deadlines, and some of you might be writing papers on Midsummer Night's Dream. And while I wasn't necessarily thinking that you would write a paper about the sonnets, I'm not necessarily averse to it, though you would have to run your ideas by me. And I gave you a suggested paper topic, but you can also come up with your own paper topics as long as you get them approved by me. So today's attendance question for our class discussion forum that'll be due on the 5th of March, which is Wednesday. Of course, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are certainly encouraged to. What you are required to do is to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. Is what do you think is the main message in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? What do you think is the main message in A Midsummer Night's Dream is why? And I've just covered a few of those messages. So, at this particular point, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about our second comedy, Much Ado About Nothing, which is a very dark comedy, by the way. And also, we will talk about writing papers. Take care. Bye bye.